Picture a cargo ship tied up at a pier in 1950. It's going to sit there for a week, maybe longer. Not because of a storm, not because of a strike, but because that is simply how long it takes to fill it. And here's the part that should stop you cold. For a typical voyage in that era, the ship spent more of its working life sitting motionless at the dock than it did actually crossing the ocean. The loading took as long as the sailing. Think about what that means. The single most important machine in global commerce, the ocean-going freighter, spent most of its existence going absolutely nowhere. Today, 90% of everything you own crossed an ocean inside a plain corrugated steel box. The shirt on your back, the phone in your hand, the coffee in your cup, the screws holding your furniture together. They all rode in the same anonymous 40-foot container, stacked 10 high on a ship the length of 4 football fields, unloaded in a matter of hours by a crane operator who never once touched the cargo. That box is so ordinary, so invisible, that almost nobody thinks about it. And yet, its arrival in 1956 didn't just change shipping. It rewired the entire global economy, hollowed out the great port cities of the world, put hundreds of thousands of men out of work, and made it possible for a factory in China to undercut a factory in Ohio. It is arguably the most important invention of the 20th century that nobody can name the inventor of. But before we get to the box, we have to understand the world it destroyed. Because for the first 3.5 centuries of cargo moving in and out of American ports, from the age of sail right up to the Eisenhower administration, freight moved essentially one way, on the backs of men. The system was called break bulk shipping, and the word tells you everything. Cargo arrived at the docks in 1,000 different shapes and sizes: bags of coffee, barrels of oil, crates of machinery, bales of cotton, boxes of canned goods, sacks of flour, coils of wire, drums of chemicals. Each item had to be individually manhandled off a truck or rail car, dragged into a waterfront warehouse, sorted, then hauled out again, loaded into rope slings, hoisted by winch into the hold of the ship, and then, down in the belly of that ship, stacked and wedged and packed by hand so that nothing would shift when the seas got rough. Longshoremen took genuine pride in this. A well-packed hold was called a tight stow, and it was a craft. Knowing how to fit 10,000 mismatched objects into an irregular steel cavern so that a barrel of nails didn't crush a crate of glassware in a swell, that was knowledge earned over years. But pride doesn't make a system efficient. A gang of longshoremen could move somewhere between 5 and 10 tons of cargo per hour. For comparison, a modern container crane moves around 500 tons an hour. The work was brutal and it was dangerous. Men were crushed by falling loads, lost fingers, fell into holds, and it was staggeringly expensive. In 1954, the US government studied a single freighter called the SS Warrior, tracing every cost of moving its cargo from the United States to Germany. The conclusion was almost absurd. Roughly half the total cost of shipping those goods was consumed just by the labor of loading and unloading at the 2 ports. The actual ocean voyage, the part we think of as shipping, accounted for barely 11%. Handling was so slow and so costly that it made no economic sense to ship a huge range of goods internationally at all. The docks weren't a gateway to global trade. They were a wall. And there was one more cost, quieter but real: theft. When cargo sits on an open pier for days, handled by dozens of pairs of hands, some of it walks off. Cases of whiskey, cartons of cigarettes, whatever was in the sack next to you. Pilferage was so routine, it was simply priced in as a cost of doing business. In the words of transport historian Mark Levinson, whose 2006 book The Box is the definitive account of all this, the waterfront was an entire urban economy built around the physical limits of human muscle. Millions of people in port cities made their living dragging cargo through the streets. It was, by every measure, a choke point. And the man who would blow it open wasn't a shipping executive, a naval engineer, or an economist. He was a truck driver from North Carolina. His name was Malcolm McLean, and here is a small detail that tells you something about him. He was born Malcolm, with an L, and later simply dropped the letter because he liked the way it looked. This was a man unsentimental about tradition. McLean bought his first truck in 1934, in the depths of the Depression, and by 1955 he owned one of the largest trucking fleets in the entire country. But the idea that would consume his life came to him back in 1937. He had driven a load of cotton bales from North Carolina up to a pier in Hoboken, New Jersey, and then he sat and sat, watching for hours as longshoremen slowly unloaded truck after truck ahead of him, hauling the cargo off piece by piece to be reloaded onto a ship by hand. And McLean, staring at his own trailer full of cotton, had a thought so simple it was almost stupid. Why unload the cotton at all? Why not just lift the entire truck body, cargo and all, and set it directly onto the ship? It took him nearly 20 years to act on it. And when he finally did, he ran straight into a wall of federal regulation. In that era, the Interstate Commerce Commission enforced rigid rules that essentially forbade a single company from owning both a trucking operation and a shipping line. It was considered an unfair concentration of power. So McLean did something that stunned everyone who knew him. He sold his entire trucking empire, the business he had spent his whole adult life building, and used the money to buy a struggling steamship company. He bet everything on a hunch about a box. But a box, it turns out, is not a simple thing. This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the reason containers had been tried before and always failed came down to a problem of engineering that nobody had properly solved. If you just weld together a big steel box, you can put cargo in it, sure. But how do you lift it without crushing it? How do you stack it 5 high without the bottom one buckling? How do you lock it to a truck chassis, then a ship's deck, then a rail car quickly, in any weather, by workers wearing gloves? Get any of that wrong, and your box is just an expensive, unstackable coffin. The man who cracked it was an engineer named Keith Tantlinger, whom McLean hired in 1955. Tantlinger had spent the war designing parts for the B-17 bomber, and he approached the container not as a box, but as a component in a system. His breakthrough was deceptively small: the corner casting and the twist lock. He designed a hardened steel fitting welded into all 8 corners of every container, each with an oval hole. Into that hole, you could drop a cone-shaped locking pin, give it a quarter turn, and the container was instantly, immovably fastened to the ground, to a truck, to a ship, or to the container stacked above it. A crane could grab all 4 top corners at once with a device called a spreader and lift 20 tons cleanly off a ship in seconds. It was elegant, it was fast, and it was strong enough to let boxes stack like giant Lego bricks. That single fitting, the twist lock corner casting, is the quiet piece of genius that made everything else possible. It is still on every shipping container on Earth today. So on April 26, 1956, McLean was ready. He took a battered World War II oil tanker, a T-2 vessel once named the Potrero Hills, reinforced its deck, renamed it the Ideal X, and loaded it at Port Newark with 58 aluminum containers, each 35 feet long. The entire loading took under 8 hours, not 8 days, 8 hours. 5 days later, the ship reached Houston, where trucks simply drove up. The boxes were locked onto their chassis, and they rolled away. And here is the number that ended the old world. Loading loose break-bulk cargo onto a comparable ship cost about $5.83 per ton. McLean's team calculated the cost of loading the Ideal X at just under 16 cents per ton, not 16% cheaper, roughly a 36th of the cost. As McLean watched that first ship pull away, one veteran longshore official reportedly looked at it and said, "I think they ought to sink the son of a bitch." He understood instantly exactly what he was looking at. Because it wasn't just a cheaper way to load a ship, it was a threat to an entire way of life, and the resistance was fierce and came from every direction. The Longshoremen's Union saw an extinction event, and they were right to. Established shipping lines had fortunes sunk in conventional freighters and had no interest in scrapping them. And then there was the maddening problem of standardization. McLean's boxes were 35 feet. His main rival, a company called Matson serving Hawaii, used 24-foot boxes. Others used 17. A container is only revolutionary if it can move seamlessly between any ship, any truck, and any rail car anywhere in the world. And that is impossible if every company builds a different size with different fittings. A box that only fits your own equipment is just a very heavy suitcase. This is where McLean made a decision that a small-minded man never would have. He held the patents on Tantlinger's brilliant corner casting design. He could have hoarded them and forced everyone to license his technology. Instead, he released the key patents royalty-free to the International Organization for Standardization. He gave the crown jewel away. He understood that a standard everyone used was worth infinitely more than a monopoly nobody could join. And so, in 1968, the ISO published standards 668 and 790, locking in the dimensions and identification systems that gave us the 20-foot and 40-foot containers, and the unit we still measure global trade in today, the TEU, the 20-foot equivalent unit. The box had become universal. But the thing that truly proved containerization, that dragged the doubters into the future, was a war. In 1965, the American military buildup in Vietnam was drowning in its own supplies. South Vietnam had one deep-water port, a primitive road network, and almost no way to handle the flood of materiel. Breakbulk cargo piled up on the docks and rotted, or was stolen so systematically that military police had to escort trucks. By late 1965, 45 ships were being unloaded at a crawl in Vietnamese ports, while 75 more sat waiting offshore, floating warehouses that could not be emptied. It was a logistical catastrophe. McLean, now running his line as Sealand, saw not a war, but an opportunity. He convinced the Army's supply chief, General Frank Besson, to gamble on containers, and in 1967, Sealand won a contract worth around $70 million. The company built the cranes at Cam Ranh Bay itself, at its own expense, in a war zone. And it worked spectacularly. At the peak, military shipments to Vietnam accounted for about 40% of Sealand's revenue. And then, McLean spotted the masterstroke. His container ships were sailing back across the Pacific from Vietnam, completely empty. An empty ship earns nothing. So he began routing them home through Japan, filling those empty boxes with Japanese televisions, radios, and electronics bound for American living rooms. In doing so, he accidentally opened the Trans-Pacific container trade, the very artery that would carry the rise of Asian manufacturing for the next half-century. The road to Made in Japan, and eventually Made in China, ran through the empty holds of ships coming home from a war. Which brings us to the reckoning, and it's important to be honest about it. This progress had a body count, in livelihoods, if not in lives. The longshoremen were not wrong. On the West Coast, the Union leader Harry Bridges read the writing on the wall, and in October 1960 signed the Mechanization and Modernization Agreement, a hard bargain that traded away the Union's control over the work in exchange for pensions, wage guarantees, and cash for the men whose jobs the machines would erase. The East Coast Union struck similar deals, but no agreement could hold back the tide. The great working waterfronts of Manhattan and Brooklyn, alive for a century with tens of thousands of men, fell silent, because those crowded old finger piers had no room for the vast paved yards containers demand. The action and the jobs migrated across the harbor to the open marshland of Newark and Elizabeth. Entire communities that had defined themselves by the docks simply lost their reason to exist. The box gave the world cheaper goods, and it took that in exchange. Malcolm McLean sold his stake in Sealand in 1969 for $160 million. He died in 2001, and on the morning of his funeral, container ships in ports around the world are said to have sounded their horns in unison. It was a fitting tribute to a man most people had never heard of, because when you zoom out, what he really did was abolish distance. Before the box, geography was destiny. The cost and friction of moving things meant you generally made things near where you sold them. The container drove the cost of moving cargo so close to zero that it stopped mattering where anything was made. A company could now scatter its factory across a dozen countries, chasing the cheapest labor and materials on Earth, confident the pieces could be gathered cheaply and reliably at the end. Global supply chains, just-in-time manufacturing, the hollowing of Western factory towns, and the explosive rise of the Asian export economies, none of it is possible without a cheap, standard, stackable steel box. So the next time you see one of those anonymous boxes rumbling down the highway behind a truck, remember that you are looking at the object that quietly built the modern world. It has no engine, no moving parts, nothing to it but 8 corner castings and some corrugated steel. And yet, it moved more history than almost any machine ever built. If this changed the way you see that box on the back of a truck, subscribe to the channel. We dig into the hidden systems that shape your entire world, the ones running right in front of you that nobody ever stops to notice. There is another story like this one coming very soon that you will not want to miss.